Hello everyone, and happy November. October is over, and I am here with a reading wrap-up, as is everyone's friend, my cat. Say hi. No. So I read a whopping 16 books this month, which is more than I generally read, and a lot of them were quite good. I think I had generally a really good reading month. There were a few things I didn't like as much as others, but yeah, for the most part, I read some books that I really enjoyed. And so without further ado, I want to get into talking about them because there's a lot and I don't want this video to last for ages. So the first book I read this month was Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl by Andrea Lawler. And this book I really liked this. This book is very queer, very, very R-rated, explicit, and it's really a celebration of identity and sexuality. It follows Paul, who is a college student in the Midwest in the early 90s, and he is gay, and this book kind of follows his exploits, his sexual exploits, his dating life, and him just being a little bit of a mess, as many college students are. But he also has a big secret, and his secret is that he can shapeshift. He can change aspects of his body, basically to reflect anything he'd like. And so one thing that he does quite frequently is shift from having a cis male body to a cis female body, and goes out kind of alone without his friends to experience the world as a woman, and specifically as a lesbian. So this follows him as he kind of explores his sexuality and his gender and has a lot of different experiences with different people. He stays female, or stays presenting female for a while, and dates a woman and identifies as lesbian. He breaks up with that person, he moves to California, he has a lot of exploits. This is a really interesting look at gender and sexuality, and I found it really fascinating to read. It's very entertaining. Paul's voice is quite sharp, and he's a fun character to follow. His exploits are pretty ridiculous and pretty over the top, but you enjoy reading them. There are points when this is quite pretentious, and there are kind of just these internal or external monologues that Paul goes on that are a little bit too much like, listen to how much queer theory I read, or my opinions on music, and it's like, that doesn't really help the story. I guess it helps to characterize Paul a little bit, but overall, it's just a tone that I didn't quite love. But those are kind of moments interspersed in the narrative, and for the most part, I found this to be really engaging and a really fun read. I think that the exploration and questioning of gender norms, and kind of what we as society prescribe to being male or female was really interesting and well explored in this. I did find it a little bit frustrating that there wasn't a lot of explicitly non-binary characters, or characters that just didn't fall into the gender binary at all, which I felt like maybe there should have been, given the subject matter and given the fact that the author, I believe, is non-binary. But I think in other ways, everything about this book is kind of exploring that space between the gender binary, and so maybe it didn't need to be said, or it didn't need to be that explicit, and I think it was still very effective. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed this book. I'd recommend it for you if you are looking for some good, fun, queer lit that also like makes you think. And I think your mileage may vary on it in terms of the tone and the character of Paul itself, whether you find it insufferable or not, but I really liked it. So that was the first book I read. Good start. Next up, I read Ravensong by TJ Klune. Ravensong is the second book of the Green Creek series, which is a book about, or a series about, gay werewolves. TJ Klune, I really like him. I've read House on the Cerulean Sea and The Lives of Puppets. I haven't read Under the Whispering Door yet, but I like his writing. I really like his characters and the way he really builds found families. I am a slut for found family tropes, so I like his writing because of that. I was looking for queer fantasy this summer. I was kind of in that mood, and so I picked up the Green Creek series. I picked up Wolfsong, and read that back in August, and then wasn't sure. I didn't love it, and so I wasn't sure if I was going to continue on with the series, but the way the series works is that each book is narrated by a different character. So it's not all narrated by the same character, and there are some like overlaps and timelines between the books, but from different characters' perspectives. This book was narrated by one of my favorite characters from the first book, and so I did end up wanting to read it and pick it up. I'm not going to talk a lot about the plot because in order to talk about the plot of this book, I would have to go over the plot of the first book, which involves a lot of spoilers if you haven't read it yet. I am thinking about doing like a video just about these books and kind of recapping them, doing like the wall display that people do on YouTube these days, because there is a lot to talk about with these books. And I don't know if I like them or not. Because I think for me, I really like the story and I really like the characters, and again, the characters' relationships with each other. There's a lot of depth to them. There is a lot of depth to the characters themselves. And the plots, I think, are good. I enjoyed the plot lines. I like the plot of this book and the action and kind of what the enemy is in this book a little bit better than I liked the first book. I think it was better developed. But I really don't love TJ Klune's writing in these books, and you can tell that these were written earlier than his most recent books. They aren't his first books. He's written quite a lot, but he's definitely matured as a writer between these books and what he's writing now. There's just, it's a lot of those like kind of short, punchy sentences, a lot of repetition. I'll put an example of what I mean here. So it's a lot of that, that's just one example, but this is kind of the writing pattern throughout the whole book. I don't really like that writing style. I think there are a lot of people who do. It is certainly very like accessible and easy to read. They're a fast read, but yeah, there was something that was lacking for me for the prose. However, I do really like all the characters and I'm quite invested in their stories now, so I might continue on to read. There's 2 more books in this series. Like I said, there's a lot to talk about with these books, and if you like queer rep, pretty much everyone in these books is queer. There is a lot of queer smut if you like your books sexy. I think I described these in one of my reviews on Goodreads as Teen Wolf for horny adults, and that's kind of what it felt like. If you were a Teen Wolf stan, you probably will like these. There are some things that are, I think, kind of problematic about them. There's some age gaps that I felt a little uncomfortable with in some of the romances. There are some like racialized characters that I didn't think were done in the best way, but they're also fun and entertaining. So I'm pretty middle of the road with these, but yeah, I read the second one this month. Next up, we have Solomon's Crown by Natasha Siegel. And this is an alternate history kind of centering Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France, set in the 12th century during their respective reigns. And the alternate of this alternate history is that these 2 monarchs are lovers. A lot of this book is concerning things that did happen in reality in history. These 2 men were they knew each other. They were friends for part of their life. They were allies, political allies for a part of their reigns. And there is speculation and suggestions that perhaps they were involved with each other sexually or romantically. Is not like a confirmed thing, but as with most of history, if people were queer, it's been written off as not that. So I was interested in how the author was going to do this. I was interested to read about it. I think that medieval history is really interesting, and I don't know a ton about it. I just know kind of the bare bones. And so this was also a really interesting point in history that I was interested in learning more about. I thought this was really well written. Natasha Siegel is a good writer. She brings medieval Europe, medieval France to life. It was very sort of lush prose, but not distractingly so. I also found the relationship to be believable. I think that the way that she wrote these 2 characters and their relationship with one another and the relationship with other people in their lives, specifically Philip's wife, was really well done. The thing that detracted from this book was the fact that I couldn't really separate the fact that I was reading about Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France in a romance and as sympathetic characters that I was trying to root for, because I do know that in history, both of these people were, objectively speaking, really terrible human beings. They were kings of medieval European countries. They were despots. They both went and fought or supported the Crusades. Philip II is known to have been historically very oppressive towards the Jewish population of his kingdom. Yeah, not really good people. And Natasha Siegel herself, in her author's notes, acknowledges this and, is very clear that she is writing an alternate history where she's taking these historical figures and making them into fictional characters. And she acknowledges all of those things. And in the prose, or in the novel itself, she also acknowledges some of those things as happened. It was just really hard to accept that as what I was reading, because it was still the names and the personalities and the realities of these two people who are real historical figures. And for me, I think it would have been maybe equally as effective to write about fictional characters that were inspired by these people, or in this time period, but not have them directly based off these characters, which I think in other ways would have defeated the point of what she was trying to do in the book. So I don't really know what the right answer was. But yeah, for me, it was a really well-written book. I would recommend it if you're interested in history, if you're interested in medieval history, if you want to read queer stories that are historical stories. But yeah, it was just a little bit rough for me to be reading about it and feel like that these human beings were being kind of romanticized in a way. So yeah, I don't know. Your mileage may vary on that one, and I do really look forward to seeing what Natasha Siegel writes next. So next up, I read, or rather listened to, on audiobook, Rivers of London by Ben Aronovich. I have wanted to read this for a long time. It's been on my list for a long time and just haven't gotten around to it. And I really enjoyed it. I think the audiobook was quite well done and well read and well produced. So that was I had a fun time reading it, or listening to it rather. And yeah, I overall enjoyed this story. I thought that it was fairly formulaic, like there wasn't anything extremely special going on with the plot. But I did think that the magical system and the story itself and just the personification of the rivers and how that played into the murder mystery and just like the lore of the story itself, I thought was quite clever, and I really enjoyed it. I especially enjoyed all of the just characterizations of the rivers themselves. I thought it was really fun. So yeah, it's a fun read. It's an easy read. Again, there are some things I didn't love about it, but it was nothing that like really subtracted from my reading pleasure. And I think if you're a urban fantasy fan and a magical realism fan, and also like mystery stories, because really at its root, this book is a murder mystery, then you'll probably enjoy it quite a lot. I thought it was really fun. Okay, next up we have really the only book that I didn't enjoy at all this month, and that is The Invisible Library by Genevieve Cogman. The Invisible Library is the first book in a series. I think there's 6 or 8 books, and it centers this entity, this organization called the Library. And the library exists outside of time and outside of space. And the mission of it is to collect works of fiction and works of literary art, from all of the ages and all of the universes, all of the timelines kind of humanity. Fascinating premise. I was really excited to dive into this book because I think it is such a cool idea. Unfortunately, I was very disappointed. First book follows librarian Irene, and her assistant Kai, who are sent to retrieve a book from sort of an alternative London. It's a Victorian slash steampunk world that they are in, that is influenced by various magical forces. So there are fairies or the fae, there are dragons, there are automatons, and sort of this combination between fantasy and technology that is very, yeah, basically just steampunk, with fantasy elements. The book itself manages to be both action packed continuously, like there is never a moment of breathing where people are just like sitting down for more than a few minutes, and also kind of boring. It felt like the author was basically like listed everything that she wanted to see in a fantasy novel and then put it all in the same book without a lot of sense of like why things were happening, the overarching plot line. It was just like, I want fairies. Here are some fairy characters. I want the alternative Victorian London fantasy world Sherlock Holmes. Here he is. I want spies and I want sort of espionage vibes, but I also want sci-fi vibes, and I want automatons, and I want these like rebels who don't like technology, and everything is in Victorian London, and the cabs are old Victorian cabs, but they have motors like cars, and it was just like it was too much. I didn't think that it was well envisioned as a world, as a magic system, as any of that, and I didn't think it was very well plotted out. The big bad sort of primary antagonist, I think, had the potential to be really fascinating and really interesting, and I'm assuming that that antagonist is further explored in further books. But in this book, it felt like he was just kind of a waste of space and a waste of time, and he wasn't well explained. And yeah, I just didn't like it. I really, really didn't like it. I gave it 1 star. I almost DNF'd it more than once. Um, but I just can't DNF books. I have a really hard time doing that, and the fact that I came close more than once means I was really not enjoying it. So, yeah, unfortunately for me, the Midnight Library, not the Midnight Library, the Invisible Library was a dud, and I'm not going to be reading further in the series. I know this is a really beloved book and a beloved series by a lot of people. Um, and I don't know, maybe it gets better later on. Maybe I should continue to give it a chance, but I just have so many other books that I want to read that aren't this, that I'm probably not going to. And it's kind of a shame because, again, I think that the concept is fascinating. And I think if this book had been more about the library itself and more kind of grounded in that as an organization, as a place, it would have been better, or I would have enjoyed it more. And unfortunately, the way that it seems like the series is going is continuing to put our characters in this alternate London that I just didn't find to be very well executed or interesting. So that was The Invisible Library. Unfortunately, a dud for me. Next up, we've got Bittersweet by Susan Cain. This is a nonfiction book about melancholy and depression and feeling sad, and sort of how sadness and happiness and sweetness and bitterness, bittersweet, go together and are really important to human society and to art and to empathy, and to even human evolution in and of itself. And how also kind of, especially the American fixation on success and happiness and cheerfulness, and always putting forward a very cheerful and successful mask, is quite damaging to us and our psyches. I really liked this book. I am quite a melancholic personality, and I also deal with depression and mental health issues. And I tend to be the person who cries a lot when they hear beautiful music or see beautiful things. Oh my God, yeah, I'm a little soft-hearted. I also think a lot about like mortality and death and our place in the universe and being a part of the world and time passing and all of those things. And so to read this book, which is really about all of those things and about the people who like me, are very fixated on that side of life, was very it just felt really good to read and know that I am not the only person experiencing this, and to read kind of about how important that outlook and that understanding and that worldview is to humanity and to our world. This book is quite well researched. It's quite a scientific, sociological, psychological book, but Susan Cain writes in such a way that it's very accessible. It is definitely kind of science, like there are parts that are quite scientific, and there's also a lot of parts that are not at all. And she draws on both science and lived experience and art and history to kind of bring it all together. I would strongly recommend this book, especially if you are also kind of a person who deals with feeling quite melancholy, being depressed, having really blue periods. I think it's a really valuable book to read, whether or not you experience that or not. And yeah, I learned a lot reading it, so I really liked it. Next up, we've got Open Throat by Henry Hoke. This book, I read it in a sitting. It's quite a short book. It's written in sort of this mix of poetry and prose, so it reads really quickly. And this book is about a queer mountain lion living in the hills above Los Angeles and sort of just observing people and contemplating its place in the world. And that sounds wacky, and it is. And it's also just one of the more unique novels I've read recently. I can see how this might be a polarizing one. There's probably people who think it's really pretentious and affected, but I didn't. And I think that Henry Hoke managed, none of us know what animals are thinking. None of us know their patterns of thought or the way they interact with humans from their end or other animals. We don't know that. We only know what we know from the research that we can do. And I think that Henry Hoke was able to take kind of what we do know about animals and their interactions with each other and their landscape and ourselves and root that in sort of scientific understanding and reality, and then create this character that felt very true to being an animal and had a very animalistic way of seeing the world. Again, this is quite a short novel. It's quite lyrical. A lot of it is written just kind of in poetry and in very split up sentences. And I think that again does a really good job of conveying the fact that this is from the perspective of a non-human entity. I don't want to say really anything about the plot because it is so short that anything I say will be a spoiler. But overall, I just thought it was really, really well done, and it made me cry. It gave me both despair for the world and hope for the world. And I think the themes and what this book is interrogating through this very simplistic structure is much deeper than what meets the eye. It says a lot about humanity. It says a lot about human consumption. It says a lot about our relationship with other animals and with the natural world, with our sort of ideas of who we are, and what humans are, and all of the social norms and made up stuff really that governs human life and human society that traps us. I really liked this book, and I do really recommend reading it. I thought it was really brilliantly done. Next up, I read Hello Beautiful by Ann Napolitano. I also really liked this book. This is a family saga about four sisters, their parents, and a essentially orphaned boy who is drawn into their orbit and joins their family eventually by marrying one of the sisters. It is not a retelling of Little Women, but it is a tribute to that story and to the tropes and relationships that are explored and shine in Little Women. You can really, when you're reading it, you can see that it is a tribute to that. There are some plot points that are similar. There are relationships that are similar. Many of the things that happen are reflecting what happens in Little Women and what drives the plot in Little Women, but not directly, again, a retelling of it. So I thought that was very cleverly done. And Napolitano's writing is very accessible, and very detailed, but not overly lush. Like, it's not flowery, but it gives you enough detail and enough sort of those human elements and descriptors that make all of her characters really come to life. And that's really what I was impressed by and loved about this novel, was the characters. I think they were all quite well developed. There are a few side characters that I think were a little bit tokenized, and weren't as well developed as they could have been or should have been. I wanted a little bit more from the parents and sort of interrogation of their relationships with the children. But overall, I think the main characters, especially, were just really well realized, and they felt very human and very flawed and very beautiful. I think this book really talks about the ways that we can hurt the people we love, and the ways that being ourselves and living our true lives can often hurt people who we don't want to hurt. Um, and I thought it was a really interesting interrogation of that, and how you deal with that, and how you maintain relationships with the people you love even after they hurt you. Um, so yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I think if you're a fan of just kind of contemporary literary fiction and are especially interested in those stories of families, in a family saga style story, you're gonna really like this one. Next up, I read Loot by Tanya James. And I love this book. I think this was maybe my favorite book that I read this month. We're right up there. This book follows a apprentice woodworker in Mysore, India, in the court of Tipu Sultan, who is a very famous figure in Indian history. And this is right on the precipice. It's the late 1700s, so it's right before the British invaded Mysore and colonized it. The book begins with Abbas, who is the woodworker, working with a French woodworker in the court of Tipu's to build a tiger automaton. And it's a tiger attacking a British soldier and killing him. There's an organ built into the automaton that, when cranked, makes noises of the tiger and noises of the soldier dying. And this is a real automaton. If you look up Tipu's tiger, you can see a picture of it. It was created in India by a French woodworker and his apprentice for Tipu Sultan, and it still exists. It's in a museum. I think it's in the Victoria and Albert Museum now in England. So that's really cool. It's all based very clearly on historical things that happen in history and real historical figures. Throughout the course of this book, it follows the British invasion of Mysore, the death of Tipu Sultan, colonization. Abbas leaves India and eventually ends up in a very long, convoluted process in England, trying to get this automaton back from the English soldier and his family, who essentially took it as a war prize. So it's quite involved. It's an adventure novel. It's a coming of age novel. It's a history of this area of India. It's a love story, and it was so well written. The way that Tanya James writes the characters and just sort of the different perspectives she uses. She switches around between characters and perspectives. She switches around between ways of telling the story, whether it's just through, normal narrative prose or journal entries. She switches between present and past tense. And I just thought the way it was written and the way it was put together and pulled together as a narrative was incredibly well done. It is a little bit of a heist at the end. There is a plan to try to get this tiger back, and I love a little heist. I would say my one complaint about this novel is that the last third of it felt rushed, which is when they're in England and when they're attempting to get the tiger back. The last third of it felt rushed compared to the first 2/3, and it felt so well flushed out and well written and so detailed and wonderful in the first 3/4 that pacing in the last third was a little bit jarring for me. But overall, I loved this novel. I told everyone that they should read it. It's a real, I don't know. It's one of those books that you read and you're like, man, the power of literature and the power of writing is really amazing. So I strongly recommend Loot. Next up, I read Embrace Fearlessly, The Burning World by Barry Lopez. This is one of the books that I was reading in my reading vlog, so if you want a really in-depth discussion of it, you can go check that out. I'll link it up here, whichever side, up here, I don't know. But I'll link it and you can go watch that. But this is a book of essays by Barry Lopez. It was published posthumously, so some of them are essays that were published years and years ago, and some of them were not published before his death, and so it's kind of a collection of old and new, and I really like this essay collection. I like Barry Lopez a lot as a writer. I think he's a really great essayist. This book includes a couple of essays that I've read by him before that I think are just some of the best essays I've ever read. So I really enjoyed this collection. It's a very timely collection. It felt both urgent and hopeful, which is kind of what I'm looking for in general these days, especially when I'm reading nonfiction related to the climate or related to the environment. I think that we are in a very dire place, and I want to read books that teach me things and that are very realistic about what we're facing, but that aren't totally doomsday. Because if I let myself fall into the doomsday pit, then I just lose direction and I don't feel capable of doing anything to create change, which I think is really important to maintain. So this was a really good book for that, and I really loved it. I love Barry Lopez. Great. In my same reading vlog, I was also reading The Discomfort of Evening, and I thought this book was fascinating. I did not enjoy my reading experience at all. It is a book that is very heavy. It's very... the atmosphere of the book and the writing is just really crushing and heavy, and it feels like as you're reading, you're walking farther and farther and farther down a tunnel that's going to end with you like falling through a trapdoor. Like, it felt very inevitable. There was a heavy sense of dread. Again, if you want to hear really in-depth thoughts, you can check out the reading vlog, but this book follows Jan, who is a 10-year-old when her brother dies. Her family is a family of dairy farmers. They live in the Netherlands, and they are reformist Christians. So they live a very simple life that is governed by that religion, and it's very strict. It's very kind of conformist and suffocating, really. The narrative tracks as their family kind of starts to fall apart after the death of her brother. So it is very dark. Again, like I said, I didn't enjoy reading this book. I'm really impressed by the author's ability to create such a strong atmosphere with this book, and I think this book does exactly what it set out to do, and it tells the exact story it meant to tell, and a lot of that is through not necessarily the plot or even the characterizations, but just the writing style. So I think it's a very interesting book to read, and I think if you're into kind of literary fiction and explorations of the ways that humans can kind of fall apart, this is a really good book for you to read. Next up, I also talked about this book in my reading vlog, The Bookbinder by Pip Williams. This book follows twin sisters Peggy and Maud, who work in the bookbinderies of Oxford during World War I. And Peggy has really big dreams. She's an intellectual, she loves to read, and she really, more than anything, wants to study at Oxford, at the women's college there. But she, because of class issues, because of money issues, because of her sister, she can't access it. But World War I and the aftermath was a really interesting time where some of the class boundaries were starting to dissolve, and this book is a really interesting look at that, and look at also kind of just the home front in World War I and what was going on in England with Belgian refugees that ended up there after Germany invaded Belgium. And so I enjoyed this book. I wasn't enamored with it. I think it was well written and well researched. I felt like some of the characters were kind of flat and some of the plotting wasn't super great. It's not the most action-packed book, you know, it's really more of a character study of Peggy. than it is a book with a ton of like exciting plot. But also at the same time, the characters were quite lovable. There were some really real standouts. I thought it was a really interesting discussion of class. Overall, I did enjoy it, but it wasn't my favorite book of the month. And I didn't realize it's actually a sort of sequel to this author's previous book, which I have not read. And I do wonder if I had read that book first, if maybe I would have had a little bit more understanding or a little bit more buy-in to the story of the Bookbinder, because some of the characters do appear in both. So I am kind of interested in checking out her first book. I'll see if I end up picking it up. Next up, I read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. I have read her poetry before. I have not read this book. I loved this book. It's an incredible book. I mean, it's a modern classic. If you haven't read it, you really should. One of the very first kind of literary memoirs, and that was kind of, I think that Maya Angelou pioneered that genre and that effort to use memoir as sort of a literary tool to impart other themes and other issues. So this book is about her childhood growing up in the Deep South and with her grandparents in a very Christian community, as well as also having experiences with her parents in, I think it's St. Louis and then in California. So she experienced a lot of different things. This is occurring in the 1930s and 40s when she's an adolescent. So it's a time of a lot of change in America. Jim Crow has its claws in the South and colors every part of Southern life. And she is a child bouncing between the South and then metropolitan areas in the North or in the West. It's a really interesting look at that time period and that culture from someone who lived through it as a child. The writing is so beautiful. She's just such a good writer. I mean, again, if you've ever read anything by Maya Angelou, you know she's an incredible writer. Every word is so carefully chosen. All of her writing is so poetic and beautiful, even if it's not her poetry, and that is true for this book. Yeah, I loved it. There's a lot more to say about this. I could talk about this for ages and all of the themes and all of the issues it brings up and all of the things that it makes you think about and understand, but I won't because this video is already going to be really long. But overall, again, if you haven't already read this, which I'm sure many of you have, please do. It's incredible. So there's that. Another book I loved, I think my top 3 books of this month would be Loot, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and this next one. This is Thistlefoot by Jenna Rose Nethercott, and this is a book about Baba Yaga's house. This is fantasy, but it feels more magical realism than really traditional fantasy. And it's about the Yaga siblings who are descendants of Baba Yaga, who are estranged. They're not really close. Bellatine is a woodworker who has kind of tried to leave her childhood and past behind, and Isaac is her brother, who is just sort of a wandering street performer. He is homeless. He travels a lot. He doesn't have a set place, and he's always just kind of wanted to be moving, and so he left the family and Bellatine when he was 17, and she was quite young, and she's never kind of forgiven him for that. But something brings them back together, and that something is the delivery of Thistlefoot, a house from the Ukraine, and it was bequeathed to the siblings in a will from their great grandmother that was kind of unearthed. And so this house shows up at a port in New York, and Thistlefoot walks out of the shipping cube, and it goes on from there. I loved the characterization of the house itself. You know, the house is a character, it has a personality, it has a intelligence. I really liked the characterization of both siblings as well. I think all of those main characters were just really well realized. And this book, really more than anything, is an exploration of intergenerational trauma. It's an exploration of the way that history is living in the stories that we tell and how we keep people alive, loved ones, and the stories of our ancestors alive through storytelling. It's very steeped in Jewish folklore and Jewish tradition, and it is about Jewish history. And so I also learned a lot through reading it and found it really fascinating in that way. But I just really enjoyed it. I wish it had been longer. My one complaint is that there wasn't enough of time spent with the house itself. I just wanted more of Thistlefoot. There are some plotting, pacing issues. Um, Not all of the side characters are really that well realized. There's one character I'm kind of like, I don't know why this character was really in it, other than to be a love interest. It's not a perfect book, but I really enjoyed reading it and thought it was really fun. So I would recommend this if you're a fantasy fan, if you like magical realism, if you like sort of retellings of folk tales or mythology, you're probably gonna enjoy this one. I certainly did. Okay, we're down to the last few here. So this is Hangman by Maya Binyam, and this book is really interesting. It follows a unnamed narrator who seems to be just a passive observer of his own life. He's swept up in kind of this tide of action and just goes along with it. So our unnamed narrator is an immigrant to the United States and has lived there for over 20 years. And he returns to the country of his birth for the first time since he moved, and encounters a whole cast of characters, people he knew in his old life, people he didn't. And everyone seems to be just kind of shuffling him off to the next person. People keep stealing things from him. People seem to really want to be telling him their life stories. And when you're first starting to read this, it's quite disconcerting. Like, it's just a lot of this character coming into contact with random other characters and listening to them talk and tell his story, and then just kind of being the most passive person alive as bad things happen to him and people do shitty things. And then as you read it and you see how some of these stories that these strangers are telling him conflate with the glimpses you get of his past, his interactions with his family members who he left behind in this country, you slowly start to realize that something's up. I think the twist at the end of this book, or the twist as you read this book and realize what's going on, is so well done. It's really an exploration of displacement and of what home means, of not belonging in any place, and of dealing with persecution and loss, and how you kind of can live through that, but how it damages you and controls you in a lot of different ways. It's also a very sharp political critique of corruption and of Western powers like the United States, and I thought it was just a really good read. Again, it's one that's it's kind of an intellectual read. Like, you kind of have to work as you're reading it. It's not just like a thing you kick back with and really enjoy. It requires some work from the reader, but I thought it was really, really good. So I would recommend this. Again, if you're into literary fiction, if you're into sort of political satire, you're gonna probably enjoy this. I did. Last but not least, we're at the end. The last book I read in October was Pageboy by Elliot Page. I wanted to read this since it came out, and I just barely got it at my library, so I was really excited. And I thought it was really, really well written. I don't think I need to explain Elliot Page to you, but I'm always a little nervous about celebrity memoirs, even if it's about something I really care about, anything written by a celebrity, because you never know, There are some pretty bad books out there, but Elliot Page is a really good writer. I thought that the timeline and the organization of the book and the vignettes and chapters were really well done to tell the story. It's about a lot more than queerness or being trans. It's about loving yourself. It's about how to live an authentic life. It's about how you persevere through struggles. And I think it's also a really interesting look at how public figures deal with the constant publicity and constant eyes on them and constant judgment on them for every decision, everything that they do. I can't imagine being a famous person. I think it would really suck. And so reading this as it details someone who is so public and so famous going through things that are very private and very difficult, like coming out and transitioning, was really fascinating and also just made me feel so much empathy for him. I think we're really lucky that Elliot Page is as vulnerable as he is in this book and is as open and is as generous with his experiences and with his feelings and with all of the beauty and pain that he's experienced, that he wrote it into this book. And I think that for a lot of people, especially trans people, this is a book that will make you feel loved and make you feel not alone. I am really impressed by this book, and I am really impressed by Elliot Smith as a writer. Elliot Smith. Yeah, I'm really impressed with Elliot Page as a writer, and I hope he writes more because I think he's got a real talent for it. So that's Pageboy. So those are all of the books I read in October. You'll notice if you watched my TBR list video that I made earlier this month that I think maybe one. Yeah, I think I only read one of the books that I said I was going to read, or that was on my end of year TBR. But hey, that's how it goes. Again, I always have, like, I have so many books that I own that I want to read. And then I go to the library and I'm like, all of these books that I want to read are also at the library. And when I check them out, I got to read them first because they have a due date. And so my TBR lists that I make are never, ever followed. And I'm trying to be better about it. But clearly, I'm not being successful. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time. Bye.